COVID vaccine questions, climate targets, lots to cover with our panel of party commentators. I'm joined this week by Liberal commentator Omar Khan. Semhar Tekeste is a Conservative commentator, and Kiavash Najafi is an NDP commentator. Good to see you all, folks. How's everybody doing? Good, I hope.
Living the dream.
Good. Omar, look, let me start with you and the federal government's COVID-19 response and what looks like this confusion over the rollout of a vaccine or vaccines and how many doses each province is going to get. But the Prime Minister saying today, look, it's too early to confirm how many doses each province will get, but the provinces are laying down numbers they say they're expecting to get. So what's happening here?
Look, I suspect the provinces have a regular call, at least at the officials level, with their federal counterparts. You know, I used to be a chief of staff to a provincial health minister in Ontario, and those calls were regular occurrences. So I suspect some numbers may have been thrown out on one of those calls, maybe from some federal officials, but they're probably by no means final numbers. And I think what we had happen here in Ontario was that the Ontario Minister of Health, the current Minister of Health, went out and shared some of those numbers publicly, perhaps without checking with her federal elected counterparts.
Yeah, but
so blip in the road. You know, I saw the numbers that she put out. It seems reasonable as a percentage of the overall federal procurement. My question is, why are we only asking for that level at this point? It looks like, based on what Ontario estimates that they'll be getting, they'll only be able to cover the most vulnerable populations between January and March. So why aren't we leveraging our purchasing power to get more supply earlier? There might be a perfectly plausible explanation for that, but I just think the public needs to know.
All right, Semhar, let me turn to you. Is this just predictable pandemic confusion, or letting numbers get out ahead of the settled numbers at some point, or is there more to this? It becomes difficult politically for the federal government to walk those numbers back, if that's a possibility, after the provinces have announced them. So I guess I'm wondering here whether there's any politics being played here. Is this all innocent?
Yeah, I'd say it's consistent pandemic confusion. We've seen that the federal response around this pandemic has been confusing at the best of times. Wear masks, don't wear masks, confusion over the types of masks. Leave your house, don't see people, you can see two people. I mean, it's been a total mess from a communication standpoint. So I think that has now, continued on to the issue of vaccines. And I'd say this, I think from a Canadian public standpoint, they're not interested in the inner workings of government and how they're deciding the allocations. What they want to know is that when the vaccines become available, Canadians and Ontarians who need them, and frankly, all Canadians, will have access to them. And what they expect from their government is to have that plan laid out and the strategy around it clearly communicated to the provinces, and for the provinces to then communicate that to the residents of those provinces. And that's been a failure in the response.
Kiavash, what are your thoughts here? Are we seeing the provinces and the feds playing any kind of politics with this? Is this all innocent, or is it part of a wider concern about coordination challenges to sort of clear message stuff to Canadians?
Peter, we're definitely seeing that the approach that everybody had hoped for in the first wave, the approach of Team Canada, everybody on the same page, everybody in it together, working closely, putting politics aside, all of that is melting away. And it's seriously disconcerting. You've got, just yesterday, every 15 minutes, we lost a Canadian to COVID. And this situation is going to get worse in this second wave. The possibility of a third wave or a very elongated second wave is a real possibility. We're going to have a difficult year ahead of us. And if our leaders and our public officials cannot get their messaging right, we're going to have a lot of problems. Yeah. One of them is going to be vaccine hesitancy. If we don't get the messaging right, if we're not clear when to expect it, what to expect from the vaccines, and how it would go, the polls show upward of 40% of Canadians are not exactly sure if they're going to take this vaccine. Herd immunity is not going to happen if we don't have 92-95% of the population taking the vaccine.
Omar, do you share that concern that the Team Canada approach we saw in Wave 1 might be falling apart here?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit overblown. I think us as political pundits tend to focus on these things a little bit more than the general public. I think the federal government needs to focus on what's in their lane, and what is in their lane is vaccine procurement. And I think perhaps setting some national standards around testing in long-term care. We've seen in some provinces, Ontario in particular, that's been a disaster. And one of the reasons it's been a disaster is that we're just not testing the employees, asymptomatic employees in long-term care homes enough. And you have to keep in mind, most of these employees come from very population-dense areas in large cities that tend to have large multi-ethnic populations, and that's where we have the highest infection rates for a whole host of socioeconomic reasons. But I think where perhaps some of the provinces are falling short is in that testing strategy, and I think that's a role the federal government should be playing, particularly as it pertains to long-term care.
Right. Okay. So, Semhar, is there more? Touch on what Omar said. More the federal government should be doing here, because the bottom line here is, I know you suggest that the pundits pay a little more attention to this, but I think the issue here is that Canadians need to hear a clear message about how they're supposed to behave, what they're supposed to expect, if you're going to get buy-in for people to fight as a team against the pandemic. And is the messaging clear to Canadians?
No, the message isn't clear to Canadians. That's part of the problem. I'd say the provinces are very clear on what role the federal government can play. They've asked time and time again for rapid testing to be approved in Canada, for them to have access to it, for rapid tests to be made available, at the border, in long-term care homes, and so on. So I'd say the federal government should focus on the things that are in its purview and the things that it can control, and it hasn't been doing that so far. I mean, we heard the threat of imposing the Emergencies Act, and instead of focusing on what the provinces are doing wrong, the feds should be focusing on what they can do to help mitigate the problem. We know that millions of people are coming through the border as essential workers. Well, none of them are being traced. They're not being tested. And we don't know where they're going once they come into the country and how they may or may not be spreading the virus if they do have it. So right. I'd say there is a ton of work for the federal government to be doing, and they should be focusing on what's in their purview.
Kiavash, how do you feel about that? So if you say the Team Canada approach seems to be falling apart somewhat, how does the federal government lead a process to try and pull it back together?
I mean, to begin with, they have to start leading. I feel like they're to a great extent missing from action. A lot of the conversations seem to be about jurisdiction and trying to grandstand each other, as opposed to bringing everybody together and figuring out what the next steps are. At the end of the day, a citizen of Canada is a citizen of Canada, and I would say the same thing at the city levels. To have a different set of rules in Peel versus York versus Vaughan versus Toronto doesn't make sense, because it's not like you actually realize a GPS in your head going off that the rules have changed now.
All right.
I think we need to have a Team Canada approach, and it requires federal leadership at that.
Quick comments to end our time today. Let's talk about the climate framework unveiled by the government today. Omar, the Prime Minister continually refers to the climate crisis we're facing, and yet the first set of targets we'll see out of this framework will be 2030. There's no penalty for not meeting the targets. He promised a more aggressive approach to fighting climate change. Is this that?
Well, you have to understand that the Prime Minister also faces a number of conservative-oriented premiers across the country, many of whom, quite frankly, I don't think believe that climate change is a real existential crisis. So, I think it's promising that the federal government has set targets. I think they've moved the targets up from what they were previously thinking about. But, we have a government here in Ontario that is spending taxpayers' money putting, ridiculous stickers or forcing businesses to post ridiculous stickers, falsely claiming that a federal carbon tax or a price on pollution is going to come out of their pockets when it's not. I think if the provinces spent, particularly the provinces governed by conservative premiers, I think if they spent a little bit more time actually coming up with robust responses to fight climate change rather than picking useless political fights with the federal government, I think we'd be a lot further along.
All right, Semhar, what do you think of what we saw unveiled by the Liberal government today?
Well, I think it's funny to see that the government was nowhere near being on the path to achieve its 2030 targets. So what it did is it moved the goalpost 20 years down the line to 2050, and then changed the commitments to net zero. If you're nowhere near reaching your targets,
to be fair here, no federal government's ever hit any of the targets any of them ever set.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. So they've moved the goalpost down the line, probably knowing they won't achieve net zero and nobody will achieve net zero in 2050, and then pretending that they actually have a framework or a plan to tackle climate change in Canada, which, frankly, we don't. And if that's what we're deciding to do as a society, to set these targets we know we can't reach and pretend we're actually addressing climate change, then we have to have a more serious conversation. And I want to say, I'm not saying leaving anybody sort of out of the formula here. I think the Conservatives also have to come to the table with a credible plan to address climate change.
I think Semhar's signal's frozen there. So let me move to you, Kiavash, for a final comment from you. What do you make of this framework released today?
Peter, we are 5 years into the Justin Trudeau mandate, and he is still operating under Stephen Harper's targets. And he has failed to meet any of those targets. What we see today, instead of the green revolution that we had been promised back in September, what we see today is a thin bill that is going to push any of the targets. The first reporting on it would be 2030. And even if they don't meet, whichever government doesn't meet those targets, the only punishment they would have to have is that they have to write a report. I don't think this is the way that you're going to be dealing with this existential crisis of climate change. And I really hope that Parliament can really change this bill into something meaningful.
All right, we'll see what happens. Thank you all for your time today. Good to talk to all of you, and we'll talk again soon. Take care.
Pleasure.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us.